Many people think that authority is something that you add. You add confidence, you add certainty, you add polish. Maybe you lower your voice, you tidy up your language, you try to sound like someone who knows. But in my experience, authority doesn't really come from adding anything at all. Instead, it comes from removing what no longer belongs. And I learned that very early on, long before I had a business, long before I trained, long before I even really knew what authority meant. I learned it, weirdly, hello, here's one of my Zoom cats, in the theatre, doing a job that most people would barely even notice. That job was what was known as a showman. So my first professional job in the theatre wasn't as an actor. I didn't have any lines, I wasn't performing anything, I wasn't even on the stage while the curtains were open. So the role of being a showman only involves the interval, and I was in a play called Orphans, starring the inimitable British actor Albert Finney. And the first act of that play took place in a downtrodden brownstone in New York, and the whole place was bleak, the furniture was worn, everything on the set just basically told a story of neglect. And my entire job as a showman was that during the interval I simply had to transform that space. So I would strip away the old carpet to reveal a brand new one underneath. I covered the furniture in rich plush material and I changed the textures, the colours. I transformed the whole mood so that by the time the second act began, the space had been reborn. Now, it was plush, it was comfortable, and everything on the set really spoke about security. Now, I could have simply done my job and gone home, but I realised something. I realised that I was standing inside a living actor's classroom. Sorry, cat. So I asked the stage manager a question that really changed everything for me. Could I please watch Albert Finney perform? And thankfully, that stage manager said yes, but only if I climbed up a really high ladder that ran up behind the proscenium arch, and only if I was to promise faithfully one thing. If Albert ever glanced up in my direction, I had to duck out of sight immediately, because if he saw anyone up there, if he saw a pair of eyes glittering in the darkness, well, it could throw him completely. And that alone taught me something. And so every night I would climb up that narrow, rickety ladder right up to the lighting tower at the top, and I would observe a master of theatrics in motion. Because from that privileged position behind the proscenium arch, I was able to view Albert not from the audience's viewpoint, not caught up in illusion, not swept along by the emotion, but from effectively behind the machinery of theatre itself. And what I saw was frankly not what I expected, because Albert Finney was not big on stage in the way that perhaps people might imagine. He didn't push, he didn't strain, he didn't inflate himself. What he had instead was, number one, precision. And I mean absolute, unshakable precision. Every movement, every gesture, every tonality was intentional. And he timed every entrance to the second. For example, for his very first entrance, he would begin singing in his dressing room at the exact same point every night. And then, still singing, he would walk around the back of the theatre so that he sounded as though he was climbing up the fire escape at the back of the brownstone. And so his voice grew gradually louder and louder as he approached the stage, and then every night, without fail, he appeared exactly on cue. His timing was impeccable, perfect, not approximate, not good enough, literally perfect. But here's the part really that I think most people miss about the great actors. Despite that precision, nothing he did ever felt rehearsed, because in the midst of that precision, he had a second critical quality. He always remained playful. He was alive. He was responsive to the two young actors who played the orphans, for whom he became a benefactor in that play. And this sense of playfulness manifested, well, really in any number of ways. One night, a white piece of the theatre ceiling drifted down right onto the centre of the stage. Now, a younger actor maybe would have tried to ignore it, or perhaps frozen, or even panicked. Remaining fully in character, Albert watched it fall. He paused, he grimaced, he shook his head, and he said, "This place is falling to pieces. It's a pile of crap." And the audience erupted. Now, I could see that the younger actors beside him were visibly shaken, but Albert just carried on, weaving seamlessly back into the script as if nothing had even happened. Now, that moment, of all the moments that I closely observed Albert Finney in action, it stayed with me for decades, and it's still with me today. I'm playfully with my cat because of it, because it revealed something subtle but critical. You see, our authority, it's not about exercising control. In fact, our authority lies in a grounded responsiveness. Albert wasn't defending his performance, was he, Pusscat? No, he wasn't protecting some sort of memorized image. He wasn't even trying to look impressive. He was so deeply rooted in the truth of every scene that he could include the unexpected rather than resist it. And that is authority. And that results in a very different quality from what most business professionals imagine they must do when they show up and when they speak on some kind of a stage, whether that's in a conference, in a boardroom, or in a presentation. Because in business, I see people with decades of real-world experience behind them. They're highly competent, they're deeply knowledgeable, they're experts, they're ethical, they're thoughtful professionals, and yet, when they speak about what they do, something somehow fails to connect. Perhaps in some cases their language becomes flat. Maybe their delivery feels monochrome. And often that's because they're relying on other people's frameworks, other people's templates, other people's formulas. So they might sound correct. They may tick all the boxes, and yet they fail to convince. It's as if they're performing a facade of professionalism rather than fully inhabiting it and then able to express it from the inside out. And the real tragedy to me is this. So often they imagine that in order to improve, they need more by way of tricks and tips and techniques, when in reality, they need far less by way of interference. Isn't that right? So I was able to recognize this pattern in myself later on in my own life, because I could always speak fluently. I could pretty much sell virtually from birth. I could perform smooth confidence, sorry about that, and competence with relative ease. But increasingly over time, none of that posturing was really fully aligned. So even though my words landed, they didn't necessarily resonate as fully as they might have done. Because unlike Albert Finney at that stage of my life, at that point, I wasn't deeply anchored. And it was only when I had to rebuild my life from the ground up that I was really forced to confront and then to try to bridge that gap. Not by abandoning my past technique, not by rejecting my ability to be professional, but by really taking away what I had effectively learned to hide behind. And what remained was quieter, it was calmer, because it was essentially more honest. And paradoxically, perhaps, and certainly counterintuitive in the noisy old world of Shanghai, my soft-spoken gentleness became far more persuasive than my competitors' shouts and my competitors' cries and tricks and tips and techniques. You see, our authority, it doesn't need to shout and declare itself. It doesn't require some sort of special power posture. It doesn't need us to rush to potted words of wisdom. Instead, our authority emerges when our experience, our values, our language, and our truth are aligned. And then our precision serves our truth. Then our structures support our presence. Then, like Albert, we're no longer trying to sound like someone we once were or someone we feel we ought to be, but finally we sound like ourselves. And that's when people finally listen. And that's when they lean in, just as they did for Albert Finney during Orphans. Not because we're louder, but because, in effect, we are more real. Now, if you're a mature professional and something in this video is speaking to you, I want you to know this. Number one, firstly, you are not broken, my friend. Number two, secondly, you are not lacking in clarity. Like me, you've probably outgrown the way you've been expressing your authority. And you know what? That is a far more interesting problem to solve. If this way of thinking resonates, you may want to subscribe to this channel because I'm going to be sharing more gentle reflections like this over the weeks and months to come.